There is a verdict now announced in the David Hendricks murder case. Let's go live to the Law and Justice Center. Here's WJBC's Adam Nielsen.
Steve, David Hendricks is a free man. The jury of 8 men and 4 women returned not guilty verdicts on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. Hendricks sat back with his hands folded and smiled as jurors were polled. Hendricks' family members jumped up and applauded. They were told to sit down and shut up. But there was quite a bit of jubilation among family members. Laverne Hendricks and Nadine Palmer hugged Mike Costello, the defense attorney, after the verdicts were returned and after the jury left the courtroom. The courtroom was packed. It included several members of the Hendricks family, former McLean County State's Attorney Ron Dozier, members of the Bloomington Police Department. They sat back and watched silently, as did prosecutors, who, after the verdicts were read, didn't even look at Hendricks. Once again, David Hendricks has been found not guilty of the murders of his wife and 3 children in their Bloomington home in November of 1983. Reporting from the McLean County Law and Justice Center, Adam Nielsen, WJBC News.
Adam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Adam, where are you right now?
I am just outside the courtroom.
Okay, and has David Hendricks, has he actually walked out of the courtroom a free man?
No, David Hendricks he was escorted from the courtroom through the jail area. He will be a free man in about a half hour.
He apparently will have to essentially sign out of the McLean County Jail and, of course, pick up some personal belongings, but freedom will be his yet this afternoon. As you just heard, the verdict in the David Hendricks murder trial, not guilty, a trial that went most of 8 weeks, counting the jury selection time. Jury decision-making process extended over 2 days. In fact, it began just about 24 hours ago, and it was at 3:10 or 3:15 this afternoon that the jurors alerted court officials to the fact that they had reached a verdict. And just a few moments ago, the jury announced that David Hendricks was found not guilty of the murders of his wife and 3 children in their Carl Drive home in Bloomington in November of 1983. Of course, the story is very familiar to tens of thousands of Illinois residents. David Hendricks was arrested about a month after the killings in November of 1983. He stood trial in Rockford on a change of venue, a 9-week trial there that ended in the fall of 1984, about a year after the original murders occurred, and he was found guilty by a jury there that, in fact, deliberated about 5.5 hours. The appeals process went forward. He was sentenced to natural life in prison. The state had sought the death penalty in the case. The appellate court upheld the decision. The state Supreme Court upheld the decision. And then, in a very unusual move, the court agreed to rehear and reconsider its case. And what happened there, then after a few months of deliberations, the court turned over the original guilty verdict. It left it up to the prosecution to determine whether or not there was going to be a new trial. A special prosecutor was appointed. He, in fact, was the original second-in-command prosecutor in the original case. He's now a federal prosecutor, Brad Murphy, a former state's attorney in McLean County, who prosecuted Hendricks once again. And now, if you're just tuned in, the jury has announced that David Hendricks is not guilty of the murders of his wife and 3 children. Adam, are you still with us?
Yes, Steve. Family members are hugging one another here on the 5th floor of the Law and Justice Center. Obviously, are happy to talk to the news media after receiving the news. It was interesting that, while the jury was brought in, everybody was just sitting there, just wondering what they were going to say, and people who looked at the jurors, they were pretty stone-faced as they walked in. It was difficult to say, whether the verdict would be guilty or not guilty.
Let's reset the scene here for people. Again, the verdict was apparently reached at around 3 or 3:10 this afternoon. It took most of an hour for the people who are interested in the case, the attorneys and the like, to assemble in the courtroom. How long, Adam, actually was the court proceeding where the verdict was announced?
It was about 5 minutes after 4 o'clock when the judge read the jury's verdict.
And then, of course, there were a few things that occurred after that, and then the doors were unlocked and you all came out.
That's right. It did not take much time at all. They waited for the jury to leave the courtroom and get on the bus for Decatur. Of course, they're all from Macon County. Hendricks, he looked very, very tired. He had dark circles under his eyes. Looked like he probably didn't get much sleep last night. And he almost seemed to sit there in disbelief as the verdicts were read.
Do you recall what he did or said when he did start to move after the verdict was announced?
Yes, he just cracked a smile, and moments later turned around and smiled at family members who were sitting behind him.
One of the extremely interested person, of course, and a rather controversial figure in this whole thing is his new wife, Pat Hendricks. I presume she was in the courtroom.
Yes, she and her sister were in the courtroom, and both were screaming and crying quite uncontrollably for a while. Other family members stood up and applauded when they heard that first not guilty from the jury.
Okay, that's WJBC's Adam Nielsen, who is just outside the fifth-floor courtroom at the Law and Justice Center, where David Hendricks has been found not guilty of the murders of his wife and 3 children in a retrial that was ordered by the Illinois Supreme Court. We'll have continuing coverage here. We'll continue in just a moment. It was just a few minutes ago that a Macon County jury, hearing the case here in McLean County, pronounced David Hendricks not guilty of the murders of his wife and 3 children in their Bloomington home back in the fall of 1983. In the lobby now, in a crowded lobby, is WJBC's Chris Brathwaite. And what was the scene there when word drifted down, or up, whichever way it happened to be, that the verdict was not guilty?
Sudden, a reporter came running down the stairs, announced the decision, and there was a crush and a loud yell, and a little bit of disbelief from many of the media people here. Maybe we should go toward Packowitz right now. There is somebody has just come down. Hold on 1 second, please. This is Howard Packowitz. Pat Hendricks now is a throng of media. Nadine Palmer also on her way down the stairs from the fifth. Let's see if we can... Have you got Howard?
We don't hear Howard at the moment. Let me see if I can bring him in here. Let's try it once more.
Steve, you must understand that there is a throng of people here. I will try to get my microphone in. Smiling Nadine Palmer waiting to get through the crowd here, and we will try to get to them as soon as possible.
Knowing his character, knowing his personality, he is so gentle and tender with my children. He could have never struck the first blow to hurt his baby. I just trust now that somehow, and I don't know how, I'm not familiar with the legal process, he'd like to see the real murderer or murderers apprehended.
When you say criminal justice system, let's put David away what can you say? What do you want to do?
This is Nadine Palmer. Mrs. Palmer, can you tell us your reaction to the verdict?
Yes, sir. I praise the Lord for the truth coming out.
The competition to get a hold of these people is just incredible here. If you don't mind, I'm going to send it back to Steve Vogel here.
All right, thank you very much. You're hearing a reaction in the lobby of the Law and Justice Center, where David Hendricks has been pronounced not guilty by a Macon County jury of the murders of his wife and 3 children in Bloomington back in November of 1983. WJBC's Colleen Reynolds has talked with the lead defense attorney in the Hendricks case, that is Mike Costello. Colleen, what can you tell us?
Well, Steve, I can tell you that immediately after the verdict was read, family members huddled just right outside of the courtroom, and they said a prayer of thanks. Laverne Hendricks, David's mother, said that it was wonderful, said, I knew the Lord was going to come in for us. Immediately after the verdict, I caught up with David Hendricks' attorney, Mike Costello, also Liz Palmer, who is the sister of the deceased Susie Hendricks, and also Nadine Palmer, who is the mother of Susan Hendricks. Those interviews I have one after another, probably running about 10 minutes in length. So, Steve, I will understand if you need to break in with some live interviews. We understand that Pat Hendricks is in the lobby. David Hendricks will give statements in probably about 20 minutes. But I'll let you just listen in on some of the questions and answers, and you can get a sense of what it was like here right outside the courtroom after the verdict of not guilty was read, starting with Mike Costello, David Hendricks' attorney. Can you tell me how you feel right at this moment?
I feel ecstatic. I think the system works. We had a good jury, and the state put up everything they had, and we let the jury decide it.
What do you think was the most important piece of evidence in this trial?
There was no single important piece. The issue was and still is stomach contents, and he cannot be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt on that.
What did you think? I mean, was there any point in the trial where you felt that you had either won or lost it?
No.
What were you thinking last night as you were waiting?
I was scared, but I was confident. I was frightened that something might go wrong, but it didn't.
Was this the most difficult case you've ever handled?
No.
What about the comments that you made about those letters this morning? You know, you were describing them as awful and so forth. What do you really think about those letters and about David Hendricks?
I can't comment. One, he's my client. Two, those letters are sealed.
What do you think about David Hendricks as a man? I mean, you took the case.
I like him. He didn't commit murder. The jury says so. He's a nice person.
There you have it. That's Mike Costello. Steve, if you've got some time, I can give you the interview that we have with Liz Palmer, who is Susie Hendricks.
All right, Colleen, what I'll ask you to do is perhaps make your way down to our broadcast position in the lobby, and perhaps we'd have better quality transmission. And we'll get back to you here in just a moment. For the people who are just getting into their cars, a jury here in Bloomington just a few minutes ago pronounced David Hendricks not guilty of the bloody 1983 axe murders of his wife and 3 children, a crime for which he had already been found guilty in an earlier trial. And as you heard Adam Nielsen report from just outside the courtroom, just moments after the verdict was announced, friends and relatives burst into applause in the packed courtroom as the verdict was read. Judge Richard Boehner had ordered the courtroom sealed as the jury was being polled about its verdict. And there was a cordon of rather somber-faced sheriff's deputies forming a cordon to escort the 8 men and 5 women out of the court for a bus ride back to their Decatur homes. And as you know, Hendricks' earlier conviction was overturned by the state Supreme Court on grounds that improper evidence was admitted at his first trial. Again, David Hendricks found innocent of the murders of his wife and 3 children. Our coverage being brought to you at this moment by OK Appliance and by Pekin Insurance. We'll continue in 1 minute.
Now it's...
If you just joined us once again, David Hendricks has been found innocent of the axe murders of his wife and 3 children in Bloomington in 1983. The verdict was announced about a half hour ago, and then word getting to the outside world as the courtroom was unsealed perhaps 20 minutes or 15 minutes ago. Pat Hendricks is the wife of David Hendricks, and she was in the courtroom when the verdict was announced. WJBC's Howard Packowitz is with her now.
Steve, I have Pat Hendricks live here outside the McLean County Law and Justice Center. What went through your mind when you heard that there was a verdict, and then when it was actually announced?
I was scared. My children have been waiting for their dad to come home for a long time, and my heart felt like it was coming out of my chest sitting there in the room waiting for the verdict. And believe it or not, this morning I actually mentally decided I should prepare myself for a guilty verdict because I've got to face reality for these kids and try to keep myself together. So I'm glad the reality of that didn't come true, obviously.
Okay. What do you think the key to this case was? What do you think stuck with the jury?
There's no evidence, and there was reasonable doubt. And I'm grateful that the jury held the prosecution to their role of proving that they had their case, and they obviously didn't have a case. And I think the verdict speaks for itself.
Pat, was there any disagreement over whether to put David on the stand this time?
Well, it was something that we had to wrestle with. David wanted to take the stand. He wanted to exonerate himself and prove himself innocent. But when you're up against the kind of a system where people will put you on the stand and rake you over the coals, it's a tough decision to make.
How will you celebrate?
I want to go home and hug my husband.
What?
All I want to do.
Have you been notified of the process of your husband being freed?
Well, I think he's being processed out now, and I want to go find him.
One more thing. Are you going to stay in Downs?
We don't know. We haven't decided.
Stay in the county.
Can't answer that. We have not discussed those things. We did not take a not guilty verdict for granted. We have just been in very intense prayer. We've worked hard. We've prayed hard. We're just grateful that a not guilty verdict came through.
Yeah, you've criticized the judicial system for a long time now. They let him go today. Your thoughts?
My thoughts are I'm concerned that there are other innocent people behind bars that shouldn't be there. When the police zero in on one suspect and don't check the others, it's a dangerous thing, and I would like to see the real murderers found.
Is he going to have a hand in anything resembling trying to help the police to try to figure out who might really have been the killer?
I don't know that the police really want to know who the killer is. They zeroed in on an innocent man. I would hope so. I don't know how the law works, but I would hope they would look for the real killers. The jury has made up their minds that David Hendricks did not do this. Now, who did? Let's find the real murderer. There's a murderer that has been out in society now for almost 8 years. Has he murdered since then? I hope not.
Has this jury came back with a verdict that was not guilty? Do you believe that means they think that David was innocent of the crime?
I can only say the verdict speaks for itself. But I'd like to give each one of those jurors a big hug.
Pat, I'm sorry. Steve Vogel is on the line. He was the one that wrote the book about David in the first place. He has some questions that he would like to ask you very briefly, if you could just listen.
Pat, can you hear me?
Go ahead and find out where David is.
Pat, can you hear me?
Hi, Steve.
Pat, something that's on the minds of many people, I'm sure, is in the news today in both the Pantograph and here on WJBC, the account of the letters which David apparently wrote, rather sexually graphic letters, to a female inmate at the jail. You made some comments about it last evening, saying that you thought it was very poor timing. You indicated your husband had told you about them and tearfully apologized for them. But surely that must have put some type of strain on your relationship, and did it in any way cause you to doubt David Hendricks?
No, Steve, I can't say that it did. You know, we're all human. You take a man who is locked up for 7 years, not allowed to be with any female companionship, that's got to be tough on anyone. And then the moment he was transferred up here to the McLean County Jail, he was put in isolation in the women's section. That's what I want to know. Why was he put in isolation in the women's section? There are a lot of questions to be answered. They've tried to taint David's character from the very beginning. And this is a great day for us all, where we can see that the injustice has finally been stopped.
Are you saying that that David was set up by prosecutors?
That's a good question. What do you think? Why don't we ask the police? You think we'll get an honest answer?
Transfer in the women's section?
Right.
All right, many of David Hendricks supporters and Pat Hendricks supporters surrounding Pat here.
See, obviously, Howard wants to be there outside the jail when her husband gets his first breath of freedom since 1983. For people who have just joined us, David Hendricks found innocent by a McLean County jury of the murders of his wife and 3 children. Howard, we have heard from family and from defense attorneys. Is there any sign of the prosecution to find out what they have to say?
No, Steve, we haven't seen the prosecution right now or any of the investigators who worked so long on this case. I do believe they are still in the McLean County Law and Justice Center, and one of our priorities will be certainly to find them.
All right, that's Howard Packowitz, who's at the Law and Justice Center, along with most of the WJBC News team this afternoon, where David Hendricks has been found innocent of the axe murders of his wife and 3 children. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Okay.
As we've been telling you, a jury has found David Hendricks innocent of the 1983 slayings of his wife and 3 children. Hendricks was basically very placid, we're told, when the verdict was announced. A smile crossed his face, and he is apparently now being processed out of the jail. WJBC's Chris Brathwaite is at the jail and apparently very close to where Hendricks will step into freedom.
Yes, Steve, I'm outside the north side of the Law and Justice Center, where there's a large crush of media waiting for David Hendricks to make his first free appearance in some time here in Bloomington. there's several reporters and several family members. Nadine Palmer, just not too far from me, talking to reporters, and Pat Hendricks. The family is ecstatic, as we've been telling our listeners. We have not yet talked to prosecutors. I understand they're going to have some sort of a press conference in the not-too-distant future. Again, we're still waiting for David Hendricks to make his appearance, and we will get back to you as soon as that happens.
Thank you, Chris. Chris Brathwaite at the McLean County Jail, where at this moment David Hendricks, now a free man, is essentially signing out of the jail and picking up his personal belongings and then walking into freedom for the first time since 1983. He was arrested in December of 1983, about a month after his wife and 3 children were found dead in their Eastside Bloomington home, the victims of an axe and butcher knife murderer. And as the story is well known by this time, in November of 1984, a Rockford jury on a change of venue convicted him of the murders. The case went through the State Appeals Court to the State Supreme Court, which upheld the verdict and natural life sentence, and then the Supreme Court took the unusual step of reconsidering its case and then overturning the original verdict. The prosecution was left to determine whether or not they would again try Hendricks. The McLean County State's Attorney stepped aside in the case because he had had a conflict of interest. He, in fact, represented John Lewis and Martha Lewis, Hendricks' in-laws, in proceedings involving the McLean County Grand Jury. A special prosecutor was sought. He turned out to be a current federal prosecutor and one of the original prosecutors, Brad Murphy. He took the case along with some help from a state attorney, a person employed by the state government, Ed Parkinson, and they together tried David Hendricks once again. The actual testimony went most of 6 weeks, and it took parts of 2 days for the jury, which was transported to McLean County from Macon County, the Decatur area, to decide that David Hendricks, in fact, was innocent of the axe and butcher knife killings of Hendricks' wife and 3 children. We'll be back in 1 minute. David Hendricks is emerging from the McLean County Jail. Here's Chris Brathwaite.
Steve, this is Howard Packowitz. David Hendricks stepped out of the Law and Justice Center to the cheers of his supporters. He is making his way away from reporters, apparently trying to stop interviews. David, we're live here. Could you please talk to WJBC? David has a smile on his face. We are now in the garage. I hope you can hear me. He is hugging his mother right now, Laverne Hendricks. Let's see if we can talk to David Hendricks. What's your reaction to the verdict? Tell us how you feel right now. You're a free man.
I'm pleased.
Wait, we're going to do this. Can we get
She'll be paying. Relax, David. I'm looking for my wife. That's what I want.
The jail, I think.
Tell us how you felt when you found out there was a verdict and then when it was actually announced.
The crowd, I guarantee you she'll come.
All right, how are you doing?
Not bad.
All right.
Dave, in the meantime.
I'm too. I may be overwhelmed is the word, but I don't even hear. I don't even hear these questions. Yeah.
You're a free man.
I hear that there are questions,
Tell us
but
what you've been through. Tell us what you've been through.
Oh, you have 15 hours?
What went through your mind when you heard the verdict?
I'll tell you what. There are a lot of people that want this. We're going to have to set up some kind of a press conference when I'm a little more calm, and I'll answer every question that you can think. Well, I don't know about that. I don't want another 7-year sentence, but I'll answer a lot of questions. So.
When will we be able to have that press conference, David, as David Hendricks walks away from a throng of media in the new Lincoln garage here? It's really something. He has hugged Laverne Hendricks, and he is now looking for his wife. And I have nothing more I can tell you right now because our court is tangled up right now in this mob of people. Steve?
Okay, Howard, we're going to keep you in queue here, so we know that if you have something more to report, you can break right in. But David Hendricks has just now been released from the McLean County Jail after a Macon County jury found him innocent of the 1983 slayings of his wife and 3 children. Judge Richard Boehner, who heard the original case, he's a Woodford County judge, but he heard the original case on a change of venue in Rockford, again heard this case. After the jury verdict was announced, he thanked the jury and granted a motion for Hendricks' immediate release. Hendricks, of course, was acquitted of using an axe and knife to kill his family. The trial was his second on the charges. He was convicted back in November of 1984 and sentenced to natural life in prison, but the state Supreme Court overturned that conviction last summer. Adam Nielsen was in the McLean County courtroom when that incident, when that verdict was announced. Hendricks wiped tears from his eyes, he reported, and spectators in the court broke into applause and cheers when the verdict was read. Hendricks' new wife and his mother and former mother-in-law, who have supported him throughout his trials, hugged each other as the verdicts were read. They shook and sobbed uncontrollably, we were told. Defense attorney Michael Costello told WJBC News just after the verdict that he had been nervous but confident before the verdict was read. Costello said the prosecution failed to prove Hendricks guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And again, as you know, Hendricks was convicted of the crimes during his first trial in 1984 and was serving the natural life sentence.
Let's try again.
Colleen Reynolds is with Joshua Sachs, who is the assistant defense attorney in this case, who joined the case relatively late, an attorney from Chicago, and I believe that Colleen is either with Joshua Sachs now or at least has a taped interview with him. Colleen?
Yeah, Steve, as a matter of fact, I talked to John Sachs just moments ago. Joshua Sachs, he is rather a high-profile attorney. I asked him about the case and what he really thought about this type of case, and he said that he was not surprised by any turn of events. I will let you listen into just a little bit where we got into some perhaps more philosophical questions about the Hendricks case. So looking at this case in broader terms, I mean, this is probably one of the most well-known murder cases in the state of Illinois. Has anything been learned about, number one, the justice system, and number two, the police system?
I have no fault to find with the police in this case. I have no fault to find with the justice system. I think the police were faced with a very difficult situation, and I think they handled the thing as honestly and as thoroughly as they could, and there wasn't enough there.
And there you go. That's John Sachs, not really blaming anyone in this case for any injustice, although, we may note that David Hendricks spent roughly 7 years in prison for a crime that now presumably he did not commit.
Thank you, Colleen. Colleen Reynolds at the McLean County Law and Justice Center. Well, David Hendricks walked out of the McLean County Jail a free man about 15 minutes ago and has been hounded by family members and, as you might expect, the news media as well. In fact, WJBC's Howard Packowitz is still around there. What's happening, Howard?
Right now, David Hendricks is on his knees embracing his two stepchildren, and David Hendricks is in tears right now, and he has yet to see Pat Hendricks, to my knowledge. But David Hendricks in tears, very emotional after being found not guilty of those 1983 murders in Bloomington. Once again, the media continues to follow David Hendricks. David not answering the media's questions right now. And we will just continue to follow. And here is Pat Hendricks. You can hear the cheers.
Where's Ryan?
Thank you, Lord. Praise the Lord.
I hope you can hear David and Pat and Pat's children talking right now. We'll put our microphone in right now.
Pat, David, how sweet is it? We don't exist.
Pat?
David, Pat, come on, let's go home.
Pat?
Time to go home?
Pat, can you tell us how to lead the way?
Well, how are you going to celebrate, David?
How are you going to celebrate tonight?
Oh, I'm sorry to be so rude to all you people. I really, and it's not rudeness, I'm just overwhelmed.
When will you be able to talk to us, Dave? David Hendricks slowly walking away from the McLean County Law and Justice Center. I'll continue to follow him if you desire, Steve.
Well, we could hear and we could imagine what was going on when he and Pat Hendricks finally found each other after he walked out of the McLean County Jail. She was actually talking with us on the air here about the time that David was emerging from the jail, and so they had a hard time figuring out where each other was, I gather.
David is now running and entering a car. Where are you going, David?
When will you talk to us, David?
Well, you can hear them entering the car, slamming the car doors, and he leaves the McLean County Law and Justice Center in Bloomington, a free man, and Nadine Palmer still outside and clapping as they leave. How do you feel right now, Nadine?
Wonderful, wonderful. I praise God for all this, that they finally set him free.
Now, you have stood by David Hendricks from day one. Today we found out about the letters that David allegedly wrote to an inmate, and yet you still support him through all this. Why?
Absolutely. Those letters had nothing to do with murder, and he was sorry he wrote them, and I think that's a matter between him and Pat.
Is there a killer on the loose right now?
Absolutely.
Do you intend to press for the continued investigation of the murder, then?
We'll just have to leave that for now.
Where is David going right now?
Oh, you want me to tell you?
Are you going to be joining him later this evening?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what are you folks going to be doing?
Praising the Lord and celebrating.
He once told us that he's not as religious as he once was. Do you think he'll be joining in prayer?
Oh, yes. God won't let his child go that has trusted him. He may have been naughty and not trusting him for a while, but God will bring him back to himself. And he's already made that step.
Nadine Palmer, the mother of Susan Hendricks. What do you think Susan would be thinking now if she were?
Oh, I believe she is looking down and from heaven and thanking the Lord that her husband is freed and exonerated, and I believe the children are happy for their daddy, too.
Nadine Palmer. Steve?
Thank you very, very much, Howard. Again, David Hendricks was found innocent by a jury in Bloomington this afternoon of the axe murders of his wife and 3 children. We are going to hear the prosecution reaction to the verdict this afternoon in just a moment.
The folks at Winnie's.
Well, we have heard the jubilation of members of the David Hendricks family and his supporters, his being found innocent by a jury this afternoon after a roughly 8-week-long trial in the Law and Justice Center in Bloomington. We have not had any official reaction yet from the other side, the prosecutors who felt strongly that David Hendricks had in fact killed his wife and 3 children. But WJBC's Adam Nielsen has been at that side of the discussion for some time. Adam, what can you tell us?
Well, Steve, if you take the Hendricks family jubilation right now, you can say that the prosecution is equally as disappointed. Prosecutors didn't even move while the jury verdict was read, and they left the building about 15 minutes ago. Prosecutors and Bloomington police detectives who are working on the case. I had a chance to talk briefly with Ed Parkinson, the assistant prosecutor in the case. He said, "I'm very disappointed. I'm just real disappointed." We asked him if there was anything in the case that might have made the jury go with the not guilty verdict. He said those questions are better asked to the jurors. There was a news conference, or talk of a news conference, that would be scheduled after the verdicts were read by the prosecution. It's our understanding that that news conference has been scrubbed, and it sounds like we have heard maybe all we're going to hear from the prosecution in the David Hendricks murder trial today. Very disappointed.
Adam, you, of course, were in the courtroom along with about 75 other people when the verdict was announced, and there are people who are just joining us now. Can you once again set the scene for us and tell us what it was like?
Well, 3:10, everybody got the word that the verdict was in. It took about an hour for everyone to get into the courtroom. The courtroom was filled with family members, more so than had been there during the trial. There were also many representatives from the McLean County State's Attorney's Office, and McLean County Judge Ron Dozier was also there, sitting next to Bloomington Police Detective Charles Crow.
Of course, those two were very instrumental in the first trial. Ron Dozier, now a judge, but he was the state's attorney and chief prosecutor in the case, and Charles Crow was kind of the lead detective in the investigation against Hendricks in both the original trial and then the more recent trial.
Things happened very quickly, Steve, when the jurors came into the room, and I have a clip of tape here from Laverne Hendricks. This is what Laverne thought. Well, I don't have that clip of tape, but she did say that the jurors looked at David when they came into the room, and she thought that was going to be a good sign. Jurors came into the room. I thought they were pretty stone-faced. I wasn't going to try to read their minds. But things did happen quickly. They handed their sealed verdicts to the clerk. The clerk handed them to Judge Richard Boehner, and then he proceeded to read the verdicts. The first one that the jury found David Hendricks not guilty of the murder of Benjamin Hendricks. As soon as the word "not" was heard, several family members jumped up and applauded, and that's when a lot of crying began. David Hendricks just sat and had a grin on his face. He looked very, very satisfied with the verdict.
All right, Adam Nielsen at the Law and Justice Center. Things are starting to wind down at the Law and Justice Center, and let's find out more from Chris Brathwaite, who's there. Chris?
Yes, Steve. It's a tale of two Law and Justice Centers, so to speak. Just a half hour ago or so, there were media cramming the lobby of this 7-story building, and now we've all been kicked out by Sheriff Steve Brennan because of it's just about closing time, and people are going home, and all the media is now outside. The Hendrickses have left. His entire family is now gone, and I guess that's about it from here.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. There was quite a crowd at the Law and Justice Center throughout much of the day. In fact, the lobby, very close to the Abraham Lincoln statue in the ground floor of the Law and Justice Center, was really kind of the media headquarters. The court rules ban electronic tape recorders and cameras and the like from the upper floors of the courtroom. They are limited to the lobby area, so that's where the media kind of headquartered themselves. And, of course, there were quite a few townspeople who were also very curious about what was happening or wasn't happening. The jury in the case went into deliberations at about 4:15 yesterday afternoon, deliberated for several hours last night, resumed their talks at 9 o'clock this morning, and then it was just about shortly after 3 o'clock this afternoon that the foreman of the jury told court officials that a verdict, in fact, had been reached. And about an hour later, in a court room that was filled with mostly Hendricks partisans, along with, as you just heard, some police and state's attorney's officials, the jury decided that David Hendricks was innocent of the murders of his wife and 3 children. Our continuous coverage on the Hendrick verdict continues in just a moment. There are people who are just getting out of work, and to recap the situation, a Macon County jury has found David Hendricks of Bloomington not guilty, innocent of the 1983 slayings of his wife and 3 children. It was a crowded courtroom to which the jury announced the not guilty verdict, and it was about a half hour after the verdict was announced, almost an hour ago now, that David Hendricks emerged from the McLean County Jail a free man. He emerged to the cheers of his family members and supporters. He apparently tried to not say much at all to the media, and at one point indicated that there, in fact, may have to be a press conference scheduled at a later time to answer all of the media's questions. Of course, it's rather ironic that Hendricks mentioned a press conference, because it was a press conference of sorts, which really was very instrumental in prosecutors deciding that perhaps he was indeed guilty of the murders. It was a television interview that he did the afternoon after the Hendricks family bodies were found, a television interview he did with Channel 25 in Peoria, in which he seemed to be somewhat emotionless and made the highly reported now and controversial statement that police said that it looked like some things might have been taken. And prosecutors believe that was a tip-off that Hendricks knew some facts about the crime scene which were not generally known to the public at that time. That item in itself was very controversial in the case and rather pivotal in in the actual testimony in the trial of both the more recent trial and the one that occurred in Rockford in 1984. The 1984 trial was, of course, held in Rockford because of a change of venue, because of pretrial publicity here in the McLean County area. This time the tables were turned a bit. The jury was selected in Macon County, in Decatur, but then transported on a daily basis to Bloomington Rummel, to the Law and Justice Center, where it would hear testimony on an almost daily basis since approximately mid-February. The situation when the verdict was announced, the not guilty verdict was announced this afternoon, was that the jury verdict was announced. Judge Richard Boehner, the Woodford County judge who presided over both trials, had actually sealed shut the courtroom, allowing no one to enter or to exit the courtroom, and in fact kept the courtroom closed for long enough for the jurors to leave the courtroom and get on the bus with their overnight bags, which they had brought in last night once the jury deliberations began, and start their trip home to Decatur. And there's no word yet on whether the jurors will be allowed to discuss the case or whether they'll be willing to discuss the case. Of course, there will be a lot of curiosity about what factors were important in the case, how split the jury was or wasn't, as it conducted some 10 hours of deliberations. The actual number of hours of deliberations is a little unclear because, in fact, the jurors were taken to the Hampton Inn on Bloomington's east side last evening. We were told because the conditions inside the Law and Justice Center were extremely warm and the jurors were uncomfortable. They were going to spend the night at the Hampton Inn at any regard, so they apparently were in a conference room of some sort there at the Hampton Inn. And so the jury deliberations proceeded at some rate that we are not exactly clear on at this point. We know they were served dinner there and then retired for the evening sometime last night. We got word that they retired at around 10:30 last evening. Whether they had retired substantially before that or not, we don't know. We do know that the talks presumably began again at about 9 o'clock this morning. They had lunch at the Hampton Inn, and then it was just after 3 o'clock this afternoon that the jury announced to court officials that a jury verdict had been reached, and an hour later it was announced in open court, not guilty for David Hendricks and the murders of his wife and 3 children. We'll be back in just a moment. It's 8 minutes after 5 o'clock. To recap the afternoon developments, it was an hour ago that a jury in Bloomington acquitted businessman David Hendricks of the axe murders of his wife and 3 children, a crime for which he already had been found guilty in an earlier trial. And as we reported from the scene, friends and relatives burst into applause and tears in the packed courtroom as the verdict was read. The courtroom had been sealed as the jury was being polled about its verdict, and sheriff's deputies had formed a cordon to escort the 8 men and 5 women out of the court for the bus ride back to their Decatur homes. Hendricks' earlier conviction, of course, overturned by the Illinois Supreme Court on grounds that improper evidence was admitted at his first trial. Most of that evidence was not allowed in his second trial, which began in mid-February here in McLean County after a jury was selected in Macon County in Decatur. That jury, of course, the one that now has freed David Hendricks for the first time since December of 1983. It was in December of 83, a month after the murders, that Hendricks was arrested. He was held without bond until his trial began in the fall of 1984, and then, of course, was convicted and sentenced to natural life in prison after the prosecution had sought the death penalty in the case. He served his time at the Menard Prison in southern Illinois. He was there for the entire time after his conviction in Rockford, except for a brief time when he was in the diagnostic center at Joliet, part of the routine that the State Corrections Department puts its new prisoners through. He then was taken to Menard, a old and looming prison on the banks of the Mississippi River south of St. Louis, and he stayed there until early last fall when the Supreme Court ordered a new trial, or at least overturned the original verdict, and left it up to local prosecutors as to whether or not a new trial will in fact be held. It was, and now you know the results. A Macon County jury has found David Hendricks innocent of the murders of his wife and 3 children. David Hendricks, a free man at this moment. This has been a special report from the WJBC newsroom. We'll have our usual evening report at 5:30 with a complete recap of the day's developments, new interviews, and the like. That's about 20 minutes away. Bones?
Thank you, Steve. We're at 10 after 5.